Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I believe we've got simultaneous translation, so use it. What I'm going to be basing my talk on is partly the two books, Exodus and Refuge, Gestrandet, which between them cover migration and refugees. And then more recently, I'm currently working with my co-author of Refuge, Alex Betts. Alex heads the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford, which is the main academic centre on refugees in the world. And between us, we have tried to come up with what we think of as a solution to sustainable migration in Europe. We've been commissioned by the European Migration Network, which is the European Commission's network on migration, and I'll be presenting that in Vienna next week and in Brussels in December. So what I want to talk about is both the books, as it were, and in particular Exodus, and then apply that to the issues of the moment. And just to anticipate what I'm going to say, I don't see that there's any trade-off between humanity and the control of migration. On the contrary, for over 40 years, I've been working on the poorest countries on earth, and I'm not going to compromise my humanity and my ethics of a lifetime for issues of migration in Europe. Right? My lifetime's work has been with the poorest countries on earth, and then more recently with the Syrian refugee crisis in Jordan. But what I'll argue eventually, as we get towards the end of the lecture, is that meeting those ethical duties, our duty towards the global poor, our duty towards refugees, and we must meet them very much better than we have been meeting them, very much better. But meeting them has very little to do with migration. So let me start with the way that Exodus was organized, the impact on host countries, the impact on the left behind, and a little on migrants themselves. And so I'll start with host countries, impact on host countries. Now, I am an economist, professor of economics and public policy at Oxford, etc. But the economic impact of migration on host countries is very trivial. There's been a lot of work on this in Europe, looking, for example, at what's been the impact on wages in Europe. And to a first approximation, it's zero. Right? If you want to get fancy, you can say that skilled migrants, we tend to get some economic gain from. Unskilled migrants, we tend to incur some economic costs. But really, the economic issues are kind of second order, I think. My own country has had a lot of immigration and made some fairly big mistakes, but they're not mistakes that you made, because the big mistake in Britain was to basically create a structure in which firms had a big incentive to import ready-trained labour rather than train British workers. So we've seen the collapse in our apprentice and training system. It's just so much easier and cheaper for firms to get ready-trained labour from the rest of Europe. That is a very foolish mistake, but it's not a mistake you've made. So I don't have to caution you against doing it, right? I think the big issues are really social, and that's where we need to look. 90% of the analysis of migration has fussed about short-term economic effects, and 90% of the important issues are about long-term social effects. So we just need a pivot from fussing about this short-term economic stuff, which is tiny, to really focusing on the long-term social stuff, which is far from tiny. And the key concept there is it's important that migrants integrate into the society. So I'm going to talk a little about why it's important, and then how it is done. Why is it important? There are a few sort of clear things you can point to. That shared identity, building some degree of shared identity, which can be on all sorts of different bases, but the most obvious basis for shared identity is that you all live in the same place. Shared identity helps to build trust, and trust makes cooperation a lot easier. So there's a trust and cooperation effect. And then shared identity also helps to create a sense of mutual regard. I care about you, you care about me. And if we care about each other, then we're more inclined to be generous to each other. And so the fortunate in life are more inclined to help the less fortunate, if we see ourselves as being a sharing identity. It doesn't have to be ethnic identity, it doesn't have to be religious identity, it has to be identity based on something that we share. And I've come to see a healthy society as constructed laboriously as a dense web of reciprocal obligations. On the left side of the political spectrum, that's exemplified by the cooperative movement. The cooperative movement was born in my part of the world. The industrial cities of northern England was born in the mid-19th century, the 1840s, because by the 1840s, the industrial cities of northern England, which were the first industrial cities on earth, were the nearest approximation we've come to hell on earth. One of my ancestors was mayor of Bradford. That was the fastest growing town in Europe at the time. My German grandfather moved there, married a descendant of the guy who was the mayor. In 1849, my ancestor who was mayor in a city that was struck by cholera, and nobody knew what to do. He was so horrified. He was an industrialist, a philanthropist. And so he, on the right, did exactly the same motivated thing at the same time as the cooperative movement was born on the left. The cooperative movement was workers saying, we've got this nightmare. We know where to live. We can't buy food. We're being ripped off by shopkeepers. We need to bury our dead, and we can't afford it. And so they built cooperatives, right? A dense web of cooperatives, which then spread from northern England around Europe. In December, I got the Citizens Award from the Belgian Cooperative Movement, which is huge. It's a bigger building than this. Right? And I asked them, where did they start? They started from people from Rochdale in the north of England coming to teach them how to do it. Right? My ancestor, who was mayor, what did he do in the 1840s? He was so horrified by what was happening in Bradford, he set up a whole new town called Saltaire. He was called Salt, where decent conditions were built for workers. And so you got on the right, on the decent right, you got a movement which in Britain is called One Nation. Businessmen being ethical, trying to support their workers. And on the left, you've got this cooperative movement, and they're both this process of building reciprocal obligations. Yeah? And a healthy society is the legacy of that process of gradually building reciprocal foundations. I'm very conscious of that because I work in societies that haven't done that. They haven't built shared identity, they're fractured either by religion or tribe or whatever. And so there is no basis for cooperation, there is no basis for mutual regard. On the contrary, there are vicious oppositional identities, and they tear the society apart. I think Europe has been complacent in imagining that it's always been a cooperative world in Europe and always will be. It wasn't always a cooperative world. Germany wasn't always cooperative. Germany tore itself apart in history, as you know. So it's precious, this structure of cooperation. That's why we need it. So we need some sense of shared identity and reciprocal obligations. How do we build that? Well, immigrants need to absorb into the society at some pace, and that's a gradual process. It's a psychological process in people's minds. Right? As I wrote in Exodus, my German grandfather, I can remember he never learned to speak English that well, right? But my father sort of took the psychological leap 10 years before I was born, which is why I'm called Collier and not Hellenschmidt. Right? So that's just an example of this gradual process of absorption. It doesn't have to go all the way of changing people's names, but it has to become some sense of shared belonging to the place where you live. And so it doesn't have to, I think, to be cultural identity that's shared, but it does have to be a sense of belonging to place that is shared. And for that to happen, the flow of people coming into the society has, in the end, to equal the flow of people being integrated into the society. The people who come in are not, by definition, not integrated, and you've got another flow of the stock of immigrants and their descendants who are then gradually integrating. And the key concept in Exodus is that you need to match at some stage those two rates. The rate at which people are absorbing into the society cannot stay permanently lower than the rate at which people are coming in and being different. Right? And so you either speed the rate of absorption up or you slow the rate of inflow down. They've got to match. Right? And I don't have expertise in knowing how to speed the rate of absorption up. I'm not a sociologist, right? Looking around Europe, it's proved more difficult than governments thought. But I know that those two rates need to be brought together. We also know that as the stock of immigrants increases, so the flow tends to increase because it's easier for people to come. The big gulf that keeps people out is knowledge and money. And having relatives already in the country bridges that knowledge gap and helps to provide finance. So that there's a tendency for, other things equal, for migration to accelerate as the stock grows. And that suggests, again, other things equal, which sometimes they're not, that to keep the flow constant, you gradually need to sort of tighten the controls. You've faced a particularly hard problem because you've had a sudden, large influx of people, more or less all from the same place. And that is much harder to arrange absorption because people naturally tend to sort of cluster together, spatially and psychologically. if they all come together. And indeed, refugees are not natural migrants. They're the people who chose to stay home until home became unsafe. And so often their psychological tendency is not to want to integrate. They want to go back. That's the host problems. Let me turn to the problem of the people left behind, the societies, the poor societies, which are the source of this out-migration. It's in theory, it's ambiguous whether emigration is a help or a hindrance. And we've got a lot of research on this now, so we can say it's a help here, it's a hindrance here. What we do know is that pretty well always and everywhere, the people who leave are the brightest and the best, and probably the better off, because migration is expensive, and so it tends to be young, single people, disproportionately young men, from better off families, probably have had some education and have got a sense that hope lies elsewhere. Hope and opportunity lies elsewhere. So they want to get out. Whether that's a good thing or not, in one obvious sense, it sounds like a bad thing. Right? That if a society is losing its brightest and best and energetic young people, that's a bad thing. To give a practical example from my own country, there are more Sudanese doctors practicing in London than in the whole of Sudan. And then there's a narrative in Britain, we need foreign doctors. Oh yeah, sure. Britain has 3 of the top 10 universities in the world, including my own. The idea that we're not capable of training doctors in Britain, my college, the academic who trains the medics is furious that every year throughout his working life he's had to turn highly qualified students down because there's a quota on how many places we're allowed to fill. And that quota is mainly because of the doctors' trades union, which has hit on the great idea that if it doesn't train enough doctors in Britain, the British doctors can all become consultants, and then the dreary job of being a doctor in a hospital can be done by the immigrants. Right? And the government has connived at that over the years because, boy, it's much cheaper to get one ready trained from the Sudan, right, than to pay Oxford to train them. So you can understand why it's rational for the doctors' trade union to do it, or why the British government to do it. But I can't see that it's ethical in the least. Right? Now, if we measure global GDP, as an economist, I can assure you that even if that doctor from the Sudan became a taxi driver in London, global GDP would go up. It would count as efficient because they'd earn more as a taxi driver in London than as a doctor in Sudan. Right? But it's not right. It's not ethically right. It's a complete ethical disgrace. Right? So that's sort of the brain drain at its most extreme. But then there's a phenomenon called brain gain. And that is, if you talk to people in poor countries, one of their dreams is, could we get an American green card? Could we get a green card to go and work in America, you know? And the thought of that kind of persuades quite a lot of people to study hard and get qualifications, which would mean if they got to America, they'd get a good job. Most of them don't get a green card, so they stay in their country, but they're better qualified than they otherwise would have been. Right? So that's brain gain. And, economists get up to strange things, but we quantify these two things country by country. So the big winner on brain gain is China. A lot of young Chinese work really hard in the thought of getting to an American university or whatever. Some of them do, lots of them don't. But in the process, they've acquired a lot of education. And quite often now, the ones that get an education in America, they've now got this sense that China's going to be the future, and so they go back. And so China has got a huge gain from this sort of migration flow, huge. India too. Right? The small African countries, no. They're suffering brain drain. Right? So you can't say categorically emigration of the brightest and the best is always bad. Sometimes it's very, very good. I'm working closely with the government of Ghana, which I'll just treat as an example. Ghana is one of the fastest growing countries, certainly in Africa, pretty well in the world. I think last year it grew at 9%. It's got a very good president, very good vice president, I have to say is a former graduate student of mine, and a very good finance minister. They are doing their best, and their best is pretty good, that's why it's grown at 9%, to really create opportunities in Ghana. And during the German presidency of the G20, I was asked to help design an initiative on Africa, which I came up with, Compact with Africa, which was the idea of bringing firms to those countries in Africa that wanted them. And Ghana leapt at this opportunity. That's why Chancellor Merkel was there earlier this month. Same with Senegal. Both of these well-led countries, growing fast, with leaders who are really doing their best. But no matter what they do, a young Ghanaian or a young Senegalese will be much better off in Germany than they would be in Senegal or Ghana. Much better. There's nothing that leaders can do about that, because they start so poor. It will be decades before they catch up. Now, here's the ethical question you've got to ask yourself. A young Ghanaian saying, I'd rather be in Germany. And he goes off and swims to Germany. Should we fish him out of the water and say, right, well done, you're in Germany now. We'll look after you. Right? Or should we say, no, your future's actually in your own country, but we're going to do everything we can to bring our firms into your country, because what you're really short of is proper firms. Firms that perform the miracle of productivity and make ordinary people much more productive. So it seems to me that the ethical answer to that is unambiguous. We're not there to play fairy godmother to a tiny sprinkling of people who want to get out. We're there to do everything we can in our duty towards the global poor. We cannot save Africa, but we can bring opportunity to those countries where their governments want opportunity. And we can really accelerate the development of those countries. Once we have half a dozen countries in Africa that are doing that, the rest of the continent will copy, because that's exactly what happened in Asia. In Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong got way ahead, and then everybody followed, including China. That's the process we're trying to ignite in Africa. And at the moment, we are conniving at this debilitating narrative that life is elsewhere, which even the best African governments can do nothing to counter. Because it's true. But we must help create a narrative that opportunity is in your own country too. But some of those, let me have a word on migrants themselves. And 3 or 4 months ago, I was brought in by the Social Democrats in Italy to look at problems in Italy. And it's tragic. There are 500,000 young Africans who've literally washed ashore in Italy. And their prospects are hopeless. Italy has got mass unemployment for its own youth, let alone for 500,000 young Africans who don't even speak Italian. And so these 500,000 young kids, mainly young men, are in the Italian cities, loafing around, basically, given a few euro each month to keep them alive. As the Italian politician said to me, the Social Democrat politician said, we're building ourselves a time bomb, because in another 10 years, these people still won't have any skills. We've absolutely no facilities to train them. And what will they turn into? Now, the tragedy is, and my Italian hosts didn't know this, but I do, they don't go back. And they don't go back, not because of, when they go back, their government will torture them or something like that. Not at all. They don't go back because what have they told their friends? They said, I'm giving up on this rubbish place. I'm going to the land of opportunity. I'm going to get into Europe. And their friends have said, you'll never make it. And then they've sent a Snapchat photo back. Done it. Here I am. You know? And are they to go back and say, actually, there aren't any opportunities? And so they recognize that they've been lured into a trap. I talked with a Ghanaian cardinal of the Vatican, based in the Vatican, and he is just in despair that these young people are being lured into this trap. He thinks it's deeply unethical. And only we can stop it. So, let me finally turn to new policies. What can we do? And my proposition is that Europe has got itself into a quagmire. That's sort of undeniable. That's not part of the proposition. It's manifestly true. Europe's in a quagmire because each step of the way, it's sort of pulled the left foot out of the quagmire and put it down again one step forward. Right? In other words, it's all been short-term reactions to this week's political problem. Here's the political problem. Here's this week's solution. And this week's solution gets us deeper into the quagmire. And we've been doing that for 15 years. So, there is no simple way out of that. You're deep in a quagmire. But to get out, what you've got to do is think, what will a sustainable system look like? Don't think, what do I need to do next week? There is no good answer to that. Think, what will a sustainable system look like? And a sustainable system will have a very few straightforward characteristics. One is, it will be ethical. It will meet our duties to refugees. Overwhelmingly, refugees are in haven countries bordering on conflict. There's a very simple reason for that, if you've read Refuge. That's where refugees reach. It's the least cultural shock. It's closest to their home country. It's where they can go back and stay in touch with relatives. Refugees are not natural migrants. They're the people who chose to stay home until home became, hopefully temporarily, unsafe. So, our solidarity to refugees means working with those haven governments, like Turkey, like Jordan, like Lebanon, like Uganda in Africa, like Ethiopia. These are hosts to huge numbers of refugees. And Germany, I'm afraid to tell you, but you're not on the map of big haven countries for refugees. Most of the big haven countries are really poor. And showing help to those refugees is a matter of solidarity with those haven countries, not cherry-picking a few migrants, a few refugees. Right? You know the figures, that you've got less than 5% of Syria's population here. You've got something between a third and a half of all Syrians with tertiary education here. Right? You've cherry-picked. And you still can't employ them because Germany has this wonderful system of training, one of the best in the world, which means that to get a job in Germany, you've got to go through years of training process. That's a very good system. I wish my country had it. Right? But it means you're really quite unsuited to a big influx of refugees. They're not equipped to get jobs, even though they're educated. So, you need to do your duty. We all need to do our duty of rescue to refugees, and that means solidarity with the haven countries, big money, and jobs. That was the big insight that Alex and I had working in Jordan, that these refugees need the dignity of getting a job. And modern globalization makes it dead easy to do that in Jordan. There are over 40 industrial zones. We can perfectly feasibly move some European companies to create jobs in those zones. Yeah? We may need some public money to encourage them. That's what KfW is for, right? So that's the refugee duty. The duty of rescue to the global poor is the same sort of thing. Right? It's the compacts with Africa. It's you indeed need European leaders to go to African countries, talk with their leaders, say, what can we do that would bring opportunity to your country? Yeah? It's money and it's jobs. You know, when we were called into Jordan in 2015, Jordan had these refugees for 4 years, and Europe had sat on our hands and done nothing. Yeah? We built that crisis ourselves by neglecting our duty. So, a sustainable system will be ethical towards refugees, it will be ethical towards the global poor, and it will have democratic endorsement from our populations across Europe. Elites should not be bullying either their neighbors or the majority of their people into doing things that they don't accept. It's not necessary. It's just not necessary, and indeed it's anti-democratic. What's more, it's an insult to ordinary people, because I very strongly believe, and I've got a lot of evidence from it, having talked with young people around the world for years, that there is an overwhelming consensus, an ethical consensus, that refugees demand our solidarity and that the global poor demand our support. And so properly cast as sensible policies, policies that combine the heart with an intelligent head in well-designed strategies that meet our duties, there is no ethical trade-off. We can satisfy the large majority of our population that wants our policies to be ethical, but doesn't want them to be foolish. Right? So, that's the sustainable migration is, it's ethical, it's got democratic support, and on final condition, it doesn't lure people into decisions they regret. So it certainly doesn't lure young Africans to swim to Italy and then find that they're stuck for life. Right? So that's an ethical and sustainable migration policy. We haven't got one. Right? Alex and I have sort of drawn that up, and we'll be presenting it, as I say, in Vienna next week, in Brussels in December. And we're very conscious that if that's where we should be going to, we're not there. And so the last step is there's a transition problem. That's a sustainable solution where we need to be. But where are we? We're up to our necks in a quagmire. Right? We're in a bog that it's taken 15 years of blind moving forward to get into. And there is no simple way out of that quagmire. It'll take 2 or 3 years to get out of that quagmire into a sustainable set of migration policies. Right? But first, we should build consensus across Europe's populations as to where we're heading. If we just keep arguing about what do we do next week, we will never reach consensus on anything. We will reach fragmented strategies, none of which work. Right? I mean, look at what Europe announced in July, a strategy that it would set up reception centres, and then it was agreed, except they then discovered that nobody would have one anywhere in the world. Right? I mean, this was, I'm sorry, but you know, this is not serious policy making, is it? Face it. And so you can't go on like that. If you do go on like that, you'll get not just up to your neck in the quagmire, you'll go deeper. Right? You'll all drown. Right? And so first, build that consensus on where you're heading. Then, and I believe it's perfectly feasible across left and right to build that consensus. I've just been in Denmark and in Norway, not for the right of the political spectrum, but for the left of the political spectrum. Same in Italy. Right? There is an easy political consensus to reach here. Right? Once you've got that consensus on where you know you're going, and you know you're in a quagmire, then you recognize, you face the reality of getting from here to there will be messy. Right? It's unavoidably messy. But that's all it is. It's a messy transition. And so that instead of every damn issue being an existential threat to my identity or whatever, it's just Europe find a messy path to a sensible goal. Now, Europe's actually been finding messy paths to sensible goals for about 50 years, right? That's not unusual. Right? And so that I'll end with, you're in a quagmire, stop trying to think what do we do next week, try to look for a sustainable vision that will unite people, both in Germany and across Europe. It's there. And then, and only then, start the conversation of, you got any bright ideas as to how do we get from here to there? Just facing that it won't be nice. Thank you very much.